And now, what are we seeing on the ground? It's time now to take a look at how European companies are doing when it comes to climate and nature. And for this, we can check in with Rob Bailey and James Davis from the management consultancy Oliver Wyman. They're presenting this year's CDP Europe report. Good evening. Lovely to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Good to see you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Before we get to reactions, first, let's take a look at the key takeaways this year.
Europe leads the way to 1.5 degrees Celsius, with 85% more companies with science-based targets now than in 2020, and driving half the rise in all global commitments. Finance is also moving. In a 50% improvement, nearly half of European financial institutions now report the financed emissions of their portfolios. But despite this progress, Europe is still far off track, as fewer than 1 in 5 companies are 1.5 degrees aligned. And wider environmental impacts may be a blind spot. Companies see average climate risks of €355 million, but that's 10 times larger than the impacts they see on water and 5 times larger than deforestation-linked risks. Just 5% of companies that should have strong targets to reduce their emissions, their water withdrawals, and reach zero deforestation. And companies are not on top of the impact in their full value chain. 86% of emissions are outside direct operations, but just half report this data. Leadership is limited to a few companies. If all of them matched the best performers in their industry, corporate emissions would drop by 50%.
Now, gentlemen, you say in that report that if all companies matched the best ones, European emissions could drop by 50%. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, James?
Yeah, one of the messages that came out across all of the analysis we ran this year is that progress is really being driven by a relatively small number of companies. And for that metric, we looked, the one that you quoted, we looked at the emissions intensity of the best performing companies in each sector. And the differences were really stark. We found on average the top quartile of companies were 60 to 70% better in some sectors and 50% better overall. And so really this is just giving a sense of what would be possible if best practices were spread across each industry.
And Rob, to you, one of the quite shocking findings in this year's report is that almost all companies have a blind spot and don't have targets covering emissions, forests and water. Why? What's the issue here?
So nature-related issues are rising up the agenda rapidly, but at the moment the approaches that companies are using to get to grips with nature are relatively immature and patchily applied compared to, for example, climate change, which has been progressing rapidly since 2015. And when we looked across the climate change, forest and water questionnaires that CDP asks companies to complete, we found that of the companies responding to all 3 of those, only 1 in 20 have a science-based target for reducing emissions and a target for preventing deforestation, a zero deforestation commitment, and a target for reducing water withdrawals.
And James, what's the risk, do you think, of companies not recognising these interlinkages?
Well, very often a lot of the most important impacts companies have and their most important dependencies lie in their supply chain. And that's actually where we found some of the biggest blind spots. And if you take water, for example, we looked at companies who have supply chains reaching into countries of relatively high water stress risk. And we found very few companies have proactive engagement policies in place in those countries and with their suppliers. And similarly on forests, whilst we did find some great examples of companies really being very proactive in how they engage with their supply chain, we found those practices really weren't very widespread. And there's a real risk that companies haven't understood or properly quantified the risks they face in this space. The methodologies and the data on nature are less mature than they are on climate, but the numbers coming out seem, strikingly lower. So if you look at water risk and forest risk, they're 5 times lower than climate risk reported by companies at the moment, and we worry that might be an underestimation.
Okay, and Rob, what do you think is needed from both policymakers and, of course, the markets to rapidly improve this?
Well, there's an awful lot actually that's going to be happening in a relatively short period of time. So, for example, this year, the international community will be agreeing a new framework for preventing biodiversity loss at Kunming. And I think really importantly, we're expecting to see the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures issue its beta framework, and the first science-based targets for nature start to be announced from companies. The only other thing I would add is that nature really is an issue that the financial services sector needs to engage with more deeply. So, for example, when we looked at financial services companies in the CDP data, we found that nearly all of them were assessing climate risks in their portfolios, but only around half of them were assessing forest-related risks, and only slightly more than half were assessing water-related risks.
That's, of course, always the challenge. James Davis, thank you so much. And Rob Bailey, thank you so much for joining us. Take care.